Train your brain to focus deeply. Rebuild attention in a distracted world. You do not have a focus problem. That statement requires a moment to settle in, because the experience of the person who picked up this audiobook almost certainly feels like a focus problem. The task that sits unfinished while the phone is checked. The reading session that produced 2 paragraphs before the attention drifted to something else. The conversation that was interrupted by the internal narrative about the notification that just arrived. The meeting that passed in a blur of partial attention. These experiences feel like the failures of a mind that cannot focus. They are not. They are the predictable outputs of a mind that is being continuously overwhelmed with more competing inputs than it was designed to manage. In an environment that has been specifically engineered to exploit the attentional vulnerabilities that the human cognitive system contains. You do not have a focus problem. You have a distraction problem. And the distraction problem is not the product of personal failure or inadequate willpower. It is the product of a mismatch between the cognitive architecture that the human brain developed and the attentional demands that the modern information environment generates. The brain was not designed to handle constant input. It was designed for a world of intermittent, high-value stimulation interrupted by long periods of quiet. The intermittent stimulation produced the dopamine responses that reinforce the attention toward important things. The quiet periods allowed the consolidation of the information gathered in the stimulation periods, the restoration of the attentional resources that the stimulation consumed, and the development of the deep processing that transforms information into genuine understanding. The modern environment has replaced the intermittent high-value stimulation and the restorative quiet with the constant, variable, algorithmically optimized input stream that the digital infrastructure produces. The brain that was designed for the first is being operated in the second, and the result is the specific attentional degradation that most people experience as the inability to focus. This audiobook will help you take your attention back, not through the willpower-based attempt to resist the distraction environment. That approach fails because it is competing with the engineered optimization of some of the most sophisticated attention capture technology ever developed, using an individual's finite willpower as the only countermeasure. Through the specific, systematic building of the attentional capacities, the focus depth, the distraction resistance, the cognitive endurance, and the identity-level commitment to deep engagement that make genuine focus available in the distraction environment regardless of the environment's continued attempts to prevent it. 10 chapters. By the end, the relationship between your attention and your behavior will be specifically and substantially different. Not because the distraction environment will have changed, because you will have built the architecture that governs your attention from the inside rather than having it governed from the outside by whoever is best at capturing it. Introduction. The attention you have left. Attention is the most fundamental cognitive resource available to a person, and it is the one that is most relentlessly competed for by the modern information environment. Every other cognitive capacity, the reasoning, the decision-making, the learning, the creativity, the relationship quality, is entirely dependent on the quality of the attention that is brought to the activities that require these capacities. The person with divided, distracted, fragmented attention is not using less of their intelligence. They are using less of their access to their intelligence. The attention that is consumed by the distraction environment is the attention that is unavailable for the work. the thinking, and the relationships that constitute the genuinely important elements of the life. The 10 chapters that follow build the specific attentional architecture that relays this resource not from the environment, which will not give it back voluntarily, but from the behavioral patterns and the neural infrastructure that the distraction environment has built in the person experiencing its effects. The building is specific and progressive, from the foundational understanding of what the attention crisis is through the neurological mechanisms that distraction exploits, through the rebuilding practices, to the identity-level integration that makes the deep focus the natural expression of who you are. The attention you have left after the distraction environment has taken what it habitually takes is the starting point. The attention you can build back is the destination. The path between them is what this audiobook provides. Chapter 1. The Attention Crisis. Your attention is a resource that is being continuously taken from you. The phrase taken from you is deliberate. Attention is not simply dissipating on its own, it is being actively, systematically, and deliberately captured by a digital and social environment that has developed increasingly sophisticated tools for the precise exploitation of the attentional vulnerabilities that the human cognitive system contains. Understanding the attention crisis requires the understanding of this specific dynamic, the active, engineered competition for the attentional resource that most people are losing without being fully aware that the competition is taking place. The scale of the digital overload is worth describing concretely, because the abstractness of the phrase digital overload obscures the specific cognitive mechanism it is producing. The average person interacts with their smartphone a significant number of times per day, checks, scrolls, messages, notifications. Each interaction is a context switch, the redirection of the attentional resource from whatever task or engagement was holding it to the new stimulus that the device has introduced. Each context switch has a cost: the cognitive overhead of the switch itself, and the recovery time required to restore the depth of engagement with the previous task that the interruption removed. Multiplied across the dozens of context switches that the average digital day produces, the cumulative attentional cost is enormous. The constant stimulation of the digital environment is more than the quantity of the inputs. It is the variability, the specific feature of the input stream that the attention capture technology has optimized around the psychological mechanism of variable reward. Fixed schedule rewards produce the consistent, predictable activation of the dopamine system. Variable schedule rewards the reward that arrives unpredictably, sometimes but not always, in response to the checking behavior, produces significantly more powerful and more persistent activation. The slot machine is the canonical example of the variable schedule reward mechanism in the gambling domain. The social feed is the same mechanism in the attention domain. The check produces the reward, sometimes the interesting post, the like, the message. The unpredictability of whether this particular check will produce the reward is what makes the checking compulsive rather than merely habitual. Fragmented thinking is the specific cognitive outcome of the accumulated context switches and the variable reward checking behavior. The thinking that is continuously interrupted does not produce the same cognitive quality as the thinking that is allowed to develop to depth without interruption. Not because the interrupted mind is less capable, but because the deep, complex, genuinely generative thinking that produces the highest quality cognitive outputs requires the sustained, uninterrupted engagement that the interrupted mind is not maintaining. The fragmented thinking produces many partial engagements, but few complete ones, many beginnings, but few conclusions, many inputs, but few synthesized understandings. The specific cognitive costs of the attention crisis extend beyond the fragmented thinking to the capabilities that the deep thinking builds. Genuine understanding, as distinct from the recognition that a piece of information is familiar, requires the sustained engagement with the material that the fragmented attention does not provide. Genuine creativity, as distinct from the recombination of recently encountered inputs, requires the deep, associative, uninterrupted processing that only occurs in the quiet periods that the constant stimulation is replacing. And genuine learning, the consolidation of new information into the existing cognitive architecture in ways that make it retrievable and applicable, requires the specific neurological processes that occur during the rest and recovery periods that the constant stimulation is preventing. The attention crisis is therefore not merely the inconvenience of being distracted. It is the progressive degradation of the specific cognitive capacities, the depth of understanding, the quality of thinking, the rate of genuine learning that constitute the genuine cognitive value of the person in every domain that matters. Your attention is a resource that is being continuously taken from you. The taking is deliberate on the part of the environment. The recovery requires the specific deliberate actions of the person whose resource is being taken, the person who decides to take it back through the architecture that this audiobook builds. Chapter 2 examines the specific neurological mechanisms through which the attention crisis has produced its effects, and why the experience of the inability to focus is precisely the correct description of the current state. Chapter 2. Why you cannot focus. You are not lazy, your brain is overloaded. The inability to focus that most people experience in the distraction environment is not a character deficit. It is the specific neurological condition that the continuous attentional demands of the modern environment produce over time in any brain that is subjected to them without the specific countermeasures that this audiobook develops. The condition is real, it is measurable, and its cause is the specific mismatch between the cognitive architecture and the attentional demands rather than the personal failure of the person experiencing it. Cognitive fatigue is the first and most direct cause of the focus impairment, and it is the cause that is most immediately and most reversibly addressed through the recovery practices that later chapters develop. The cognitive system that governs the directed, deliberate attention, the prefrontal executive system, runs on a depletable resource that is consumed by use and restored by rest. The continuous attentional demands of the modern environment consume this resource without the restorative rest that would replenish it. The result is the specific condition of cognitive fatigue. The prefrontal system that governs the deliberate attention direction is depleted, and the quality of the deliberate attentional direction it can produce is correspondingly degraded. The depleted prefrontal system produces the specific phenomenology that the person experiencing the focus impairment describes: the inability to sustain attention on the chosen task, the frequent drift to less cognitively demanding activities, the experience of trying to focus but the attention sliding away from the task before the depth of engagement that would be genuinely productive has been reached. These are not the failures of will. They are the accurate reports of a system that does not have the resource currently available to produce what is being demanded of it. Information overload is the second cause and is related to but distinct from the cognitive fatigue. Where cognitive fatigue is about the depletion of the resource that attention requires, information overload is about the quality of the cognitive processing that the high-volume information environment produces. The brain processes information by integrating it into the existing cognitive architecture, connecting new inputs to the existing knowledge, assessing their relevance and accuracy, building the contextual understanding that makes information genuinely usable rather than merely remembered. This integration process requires cognitive bandwidth. When the information volume exceeds the bandwidth available for the integration quality degrades. Information is retained without being genuinely integrated, accumulated without being genuinely understood. The specific cognitive experience of information overload is the sense of knowing many things but genuinely understanding few of them, of having consumed enormous quantities of information without the corresponding increase in the quality of the thinking that the information should have produced. This is the direct consequence of the bandwidth mismatch. The processing that would convert the information into genuine understanding is not occurring because the volume exceeds the available bandwidth. The lack of mental recovery is the third cause and is in some ways the most fundamental, because it is the condition that makes both the cognitive fatigue and the information overload most severe and most persistent. The mental recovery that restores the prefrontal resource, that allows the consolidation and integration of the accumulated information, and that produces the creative and associative processing that deep thinking requires. This recovery is consistently prevented by the modern attentional environment, which fills every potential recovery period with more stimulation. The commute that is filled with the podcast, the lunch break that is filled with the social feed, the evening that is filled with the streaming content, the before sleep period that is filled with the device. Each of these fills a period that the brain would otherwise use for the quiet, unstructured, internally directed processing that constitutes the genuine mental recovery. The filling is not inherently harmful. The podcast, the content, the feed all have their legitimate uses. The problem is the systematic elimination of the recovery periods, which means the cognitive system is continuously operating from a depleted and overloaded state without the restorative periods that would address the depletion. You are not lazy, your brain is overloaded. The specific experience of the focus impairment, the difficulty sustaining attention, the frequent distraction drift, the sense of consuming information without genuine understanding is the accurate phenomenological report of a specific neurological condition that has been produced by specific environmental demands and that can be addressed through specific countermeasures. The countermeasures are what this audiobook builds. They begin with the understanding of Chapter 3's dopamine mechanism, the specific neurological hijack that makes the distraction environment so powerful and that makes the recovery from it require specific, deliberate practices rather than simply the decision to be less distracted. Chapter 3 examines the dopamine and distraction relationship that makes the attention crisis so specifically resistant to willpower-based solutions. Chapter 3: Dopamine and Distraction. Your attention has become an addiction. The word addiction requires precision here, because it carries clinical connotations that this audiobook is not making, and because its use in non-lineal contexts is frequently imprecise in ways that are more dramatic than useful. The precision that is useful here is the neurological one. The dopaminergic reinforcement mechanism that the distraction environment has engaged is the same mechanism that reinforces all the behavioral patterns that the brain registers as reward producing. And its engagement by the distraction environment has produced the specific condition in which the checking behavior has become the most frequently reinforced behavior in the person's daily life. The reward loops of the digital environment or the specific mechanism of this engagement. The dopamine system is the brain's relevance citation and reward anticipation system. It signals the presence of something potentially important or rewarding, drives the behavior toward the potential reward, and either delivers the satisfaction if the reward materializes or drives the continued search if it does not. The variable schedule reward structure of the social feed and the notification system engages this system with unusual power. The unpredictable arrival of the social reward, the message, the like, the interesting discovery produces the dopamine activation both in anticipation of and in response to the reward. And the unpredictability of the reward makes the anticipatory activation more intense rather than less. The instant gratification that the digital environment delivers, the information available instantly, the social connection available instantly, the entertainment available instantly interacts with the dopamine system in a specific way that produces the specific cognitive effect of reduced tolerance for the delay that genuine focus requires. The brain that has been extensively conditioned by instant gratification has been trained, neurologically, that the delay between the desire and the satisfaction should be minimal. The attention-demanding task that requires sustained engagement before the reward of completion or understanding arrives is in direct competition with the instant satisfaction that the phone or the feed can provide. The competition is asymmetric. The instant satisfaction is neurologically much more compelling than the delayed satisfaction of the sustained work. Addictive scrolling is the behavioral expression of the dopamine loop in its most developed form, the behavior that is not motivated by any specific anticipated content, but by the dopaminergic drive toward the potential variable reward that the next scroll might produce. The scrolling that continues past the point of any genuine interest or genuine need, the continuation driven not by the value of the content, but by the neurological mechanism that was engaged by the first scroll and has not been satisfied by any specific reward sufficient to disengage it. This behavior is the specific product of the design of the attention capture technology, and its prevalence is the specific measure of how effectively the technology has engaged the dopamine mechanism. Understanding the dopamine mechanism is practically important for the rebuilding of focus because it explains why the willpower-based approach to focus recovery fails. The willpower approach treats the distraction as a simple preference. I prefer to be on my phone rather than working, and I need to override the preference through willpower. But the distraction behavior is not primarily driven by preference. It is driven by the engaged dopamine system, which is a neurological mechanism far more powerful than the deliberate self-control that the willpower approach deploys against it. The effective counter to the dopamine mechanism is not the willpower override which depletes and fails. It is the specific restructuring of the behavioral environment and the attentional habits that reduces the dopamine system's engagement with the distraction sources and progressively reengages it with the deep work sources. This restructuring is the project of chapters 4 through 8. The specific mechanism it addresses in Chapter 3 is the progressive desensitization of the dopamine system to the low values. high-frequency rewards of the distraction environment and the progressive resensitization to the high values, less frequent rewards of the sustained deep engagement. Your attention has become an addiction in the neurological sense that the dopamine mechanism has been engaged by the distraction environment in ways that make the distraction behavior more compelling than the deliberate choice to resist it would suggest it should be. The recovery from this condition requires the specific, deliberate, systematic practices that chapters 4 and 5 begin to develop. The recovery is not fast. The neurological retraining that genuine focus recovery requires takes the weeks and months that genuine neural restructuring requires. But it is achievable, and the achievement produces the specific cognitive and life quality improvements that make it worth the sustained investment of the development. Chapter 4 begins the actual rebuilding practice, the specific, progressive development of the focus capacity that the distraction environment has degraded. Chapter 4. Rebuilding focus. Focus is a skill, not a talent. The skill framing of focus is the first and most important cognitive reframe in the rebuilding practice, and it must be genuinely held rather than merely intellectually noted. The talent framing the belief that the capacity for sustained focus is the natural endowment of the naturally concentrated and the natural absence of the naturally distracted produces the specific response of either resigned acceptance or frustrated self-blames. Neither response supports the development. The skill framing produces the specific response of deliberate practice, progressive development, and patient investment in the incremental building of the capacity through the consistent application of the training practices. Focus as a skill is supported by the neurological evidence, the prefrontal attentional systems that govern the sustained, directed attention are neuroplastic. They change their structure and their efficiency in response to the demands made on them. The person who consistently demands sustained, directed attention of their prefrontal system is building the structural efficiency of the system that produces it. The person who does not make that demand consistently is allowing the system to maintain only the efficiency level that the demands placed on it require. The training produces the capacity. The capacity does not precede the training. Training attention is the specific behavioral practice that the skill framing requires the deliberate, progressive, repetition-based development of the attentional capacity through the consistent practice of the behaviors that demand it. The training begins where the current capacity is, which for most people in the distraction environment is significantly below what the capacity was before the distraction conditioning produced its effects. The beginning point is not a failure. It is the accurate starting point for the development, and the development begins from wherever the starting point actually is. The training protocol for focus rebuilding follows the same progressive loading logic that Chapter 9 of the Mental Strength audiobook described for psychological endurance, the consistent demand on the capacity at the level that genuinely extends it without overwhelming it. For focus rebuilding, this means the consistent practice of sustained attention on a single task for a duration that is genuinely challenging but achievable, not the immediate attempt to sustain 4 hours of uninterrupted deep work from a starting point of 15-minute attention spans, but the consistent practice of 25 minutes, then 30, then 40. Building the capacity through the accumulated training rather than trying to deploy a capacity that has not yet been built. Repetition is the mechanism through which the training produces the capacity. Each practice session of sustained attention is an experience of the prefrontal system being demanded of more than the current ease level. Each successful session is an increment of the structural efficiency that the consistent demand produces. The repetition is not interesting. It is not dramatic. It is the specific mechanism through which neural capacity is built, and it requires the patience to continue the training across the many repetitions that produce the genuine structural change. Discipline in the focus training context is the specific practice of maintaining the training schedule even when the training does not feel productive, even when the attention drifts and must be returned, even when the distraction environment is offering the easier and more immediately rewarding alternatives. The discipline is not the suppression of the desire for the distraction. The desire will continue to be present throughout the training, because the dopamine system has been conditioned to generate it. The discipline is the maintenance of the training behavior alongside the desire, through the many practice sessions that progressively reduce the strength of the distraction pull. The returning of the attention after the drift is the specific training act that builds the most fundamental element of the focus capacity. The attention drift is not the failure of the training session, it is the moment of the training. When the attention has drifted and is deliberately returned to the task, the act of the return is the specific practice that builds the attentional control. Each return is a repetition of the control practice. The session with many drifts and many returns is not a failed session, it is a session with many practice repetitions of the most important attentional control skill. Focus is a skill, not a talent. The skill is built through the training. The training is the consistent, patient, repetition-based practice of the sustained attention demand, starting from the actual current capacity, progressing through the consistent incremental extension, and building the neural infrastructure that makes the deep focus increasingly available across the full range of tasks and durations that the genuinely focused life requires. Chapter 5 develops the most advanced and most productive expression of the focus capacity, the deep work thinking that the fully developed attentional architecture makes possible. Chapter 5. Deep work thinking. Deep concentration is rare, and it is exactly what produces results. Deep work, the sustained, uninterrupted cognitive engagement with a demanding task that requires the full deployment of the focused attentional architecture, is simultaneously the most productive mode of cognitive functioning and the most endangered by the distraction environment. Most of the cognitive outputs that produce genuine value in any domain require some degree of deep work, the thinking that generates genuine insight, the understanding that goes beyond surface familiarity to genuine command of the material, the creative synthesis that produces genuinely new combinations rather than recombinations of recently encountered inputs. These outputs are not produced in the shallow, fragmented, distraction-interrupted mode that the default attentional behavior of most people in the modern environment consists of. The focus blocks practice is the specific structural implementation of the deep work mode, the deliberate allocation of specific time periods to the uninterrupted, single-task engagement with the work that most requires the deep attentional mode. The focus block is not the time period in which you intend to work without distraction. It is the time period from which all the specific distraction sources have been removed in advance, for which a specific singular task has been designated, and to which the full attentional architecture will be directed for its duration. The pre-removal of the distraction sources is the specific structural practice that distinguishes the focus block from the ordinary work period. The ordinary work period leaves the distraction sources accessible: the phone on the desk, the social feed a click away, the notification system active. The focus block removes them from accessibility before the block begins: the phone in a different room, the browser tabs closed, the notification system disabled, the social feed unreachable. These removals are not performed at the moment of distraction. The moment of distraction is precisely when the dopamine system is most actively pressing toward the distraction source, which is exactly the wrong moment to rely on the willpower to resist the accessible distraction. The removals are performed in advance, in the calm state before the work begins, when the willpower demand of the removal is minimal. Mental immersion is the quality of engagement that the undistracted focus block produces when the attentional architecture has been sufficiently developed through the training practice of Chapter 4. The immersion is the specific experience of being fully inside the task, of having the attention completely absorbed by the material, a thinking proceeding at the depth that the uninterrupted engagement allows, the awareness of the external environment and the competing impulses temporarily suspended in the service of the task. This experience is qualitatively different from the partial engagement of the distracted work mode, and it produces qualitatively different cognitive outputs: the genuine insight, the real understanding, the creative synthesis that shallow engagement does not produce. Eliminating interruptions is the third element of the deep work practice, and the one that requires the most deliberate advanced planning. The interruption that is not planned for is the interruption that most reliably breaks the focus block: the colleague who drops by, the message that requires an urgent response, the unexpected demand that is given priority over the scheduled focus block. Planning for the elimination of interruptions means the specific, advanced communication to the relevant people that this time is not interruptible, the arrangement of the environment to make the unplanned visit impossible, and the management of the communication channels that produce the unexpected demands. The quality improvement that the deep work mode produces over the shallow work mode is not a marginal one. The cognitive outputs of the genuinely immersed deep work session, the understanding developed, the problem solved, the creative work produced, are qualitatively different from the outputs of the same duration of distracted, interrupted work. This quality difference is the specific return on the investment in the focus block structure and the attentional training that makes it possible. The investment is real. The focus block requires the deliberate arrangement of the environment, the advanced communication to others, and the sustained attentional discipline. The return is the specific, high-value cognitive output that the deep work mode uniquely produces. Deep concentration is rare, and it is exactly what produces results. The rarity in the current environment is not an inherent feature of the capacity, it is the product of the distraction conditions that the preceding chapters have described. The development of the focus architecture that Chapter 4 begins, and that the subsequent chapters continue, is the development of the capacity that makes the deep work mode consistently available rather than accidentally occurring. The availability, developed deliberately, produces the results that the accidental occurrence only occasionally delivers. Chapter 6 develops the specific practice of eliminating the noise that the deep work mode requires to be absent, the specific sources of distraction that most reliably prevent the immersion. Chapter 6. Eliminating noise. Noise destroys thinking. The noise in the context of this chapter is not primarily acoustic. It is attentional, the competing inputs that demand the attentional resource and prevent the concentration of that resource on the task that matters. The external distractions are the most visible category of the attentional noise: the phone notifications, the environmental interruptions, the social demands, the accessible entertainment. The internal distractions are less visible but equally disruptive: the intrusive thoughts, the task-switching impulses, the background worries and unresolved concerns that surface in the absence of the external stimulation that normally suppresses them. External distractions have been the primary subject of the preceding chapters, and the specific practices for their management have been developed there. The key additional dimension in the noise elimination practice is the specific, deliberate structuring of the physical and digital environment to reduce the default level of external distraction, the arrangement of the environment such that the undistracted state is the default rather than the exception that requires continuous active maintenance. The environmental design for focus reduction is the specific practice of arranging the physical and digital workspace to minimize the presence of the most reliably distracting elements. The phone that is not visible during the work period. The workspace that separates the work area from the entertainment and communication areas. The digital environment that has been stripped of the notification systems and the easily accessible distraction sources during the focus periods. The elimination of these inputs from the environment is the structural complement to the attentional training. The environment that has been arranged to support focus requires less continuous attentional maintenance to keep it focused, which preserves the attentional resource for the task. Internal distractions are the more complex and the more interesting challenge. The intrusive thought, the task that needs doing, the concern that keeps surfacing, the creative idea that arrives uninvited during the focus period is not reducible to the environmental design solution that works for the external distraction. It arises from inside the cognitive system and requires the specific cognitive practices that manage it without the suppression that would cost more resource than the distraction itself. The capture and defer practice is the specific technique for managing the intrusive thought without allowing it to interrupt the focus session. When the intrusive thought arrives, the task that needs doing, the idea that demands attention, it is briefly noted in the dedicated capture location, the notebook, the quick capture list, and then deferred to the end of the focus session. The brief noting prevents the repeated intrusion of the thought, which is often the thought's repetition of itself, as the system's attempt to prevent the forgetting of the important item, while the deferral prevents the full engagement with the thought during the focus period. The capture and defer practice costs a fraction of a second and preserves the focus period from the multi-minute disruption that the full engagement with the intrusive thought would produce. Minimalism in attention is the broader practice that the noise elimination work is building toward: the deliberate reduction of the attentional demand of the environment to the level that the specific chosen engagements require and no more. The minimalist attention practice is not the elimination of all input, it is the deliberate governance of which inputs receive the attentional resource, when they receive it, and for how long. The attentional resource that is not given to the distraction is the attentional resource available for the work. The specific practice of attentional minimalism begins with the honest inventory of the attentional demands that the current environment is placing on the cognitive system: the notifications, the feeds, the communication channels, the ambient entertainment, the background information streams, and the deliberate reduction of those demands to the level that is genuinely serving the person's actual purposes. This reduction is the specific practice of not having the phone in the bedroom, not having the social feed accessible on the work computer, not having the news streaming in the background of the work period. Noise destroys thinking. The specific mechanism of the destruction is the attentional fragmentation that each noise source produces, the small but real context switch that each notification, each background input, each competing demand requires. The accumulated fragmentation of many small context switches produces the specific cognitive condition of the person who has been continuously managing the attentional noise all day, depleted, unable to sustain focus, experiencing the thoughts as shallow and surface level rather than deep and genuinely engaged. The noise elimination practice reverses this accumulation by reducing the total number of context switches, preserving the attentional resource for the sustained engagement that the deep work requires, and building the progressive experience of what the uninterrupted cognitive engagement actually feels like, which is the specific, qualitatively different experience that motivates the continued development of the noise elimination practice. Chapter 7 develops the endurance dimension of the focus capacity, the ability to sustain the deep work mode across the extended durations that the most demanding cognitive tasks require. Chapter 7 Mental Endurance. Focus is endurance. The endurance framing of focus is the specific framing that most accurately captures the developmental trajectory of the focus capacity beyond the initial rebuilding phase. The initial rebuilding, the return from the distraction-degraded starting point to a baseline of functional sustained attention, is primarily a matter of the attentional training described in Chapter 4. The development beyond the baseline, toward the extended deep work capability that the most demanding cognitive tasks require, is primarily a matter of mental endurance, the capacity to sustain the cognitive engagement at depth across the extended durations that the distraction environment is continuously testing. Training the brain for focus endurance follows the same progressive loading logic that physical endurance training follows: the consistent demand on the capacity at the level that genuinely extends it, followed by the recovery that allows the adaptation that extends the capacity further. The focus block that runs for 25 minutes builds the capacity for 30. The consistent practice at 30 builds the capacity for 45. The progression is gradual and the recovery is essential. The attempt to build too quickly, without the adequate recovery between the extended sessions, produces the cognitive fatigue that degrades the quality of the extended sessions and undermines the training rather than advancing it. The specific experience of the focus endurance training has a recognizable quality that is worth naming explicitly: the discomfort that arrives when the attention begins to feel the cost of the sustained effort. Around the 20 to 30 minute mark in many people's early focus training, the attention begins to feel the strain. The mind begins to look for the familiar exit ramp of the distraction. The task begins to feel harder than it did at the beginning. The pull toward the easier and more immediately rewarding alternatives increases. This discomfort is the training signal the capacity is being extended, and the extension produces the discomfort that the extension always produces before the adaptation has occurred. The resistance to distraction at this discomfort point is the specific training act that builds the endurance. not the suppression of the desire for the exit ramp. The desire is genuinely present and will not be eliminated by willpower. The specific maintenance of the engagement through the discomfort. Despite the desire for the exit, for long enough that the discomfort subsides and the engagement settles back into the more comfortable deep focus that precedes the discomfort point. This maintenance through and past the discomfort is the specific experience of the extension training, and the repeated experience of it is what builds the endurance capacity that makes the extended focus blocks progressively available. Increasing duration is the measurable output of the consistent endurance training, the gradual extension of the focus block duration that the training progressively makes possible. The person who begins the training with a 25-minute capacity and ends the first month with a 45-minute capacity, the first quarter with a 90-minute capacity, and the first year with the multi-hour deep work sessions that the most demanding cognitive work requires has built something genuine and durable through the progressive training. The recovery practice in the focus endurance context is the specific inverse of the training, the deliberate, genuine rest from the cognitive demands of the focus session that allows the adaptation to occur and the resource to be restored for the next session. The recovery from the focus session is not the passive absorption of entertainment that simply substitutes one form of cognitive demand for another and does not produce the genuine neural rest that the adaptation requires. The genuine recovery is the specific activities that allow the cognitive system to process the material from the focus session, to consolidate the learning, and to restore the prefrontal resource through the specific quiet that the consolidation processes require. The strategic placement of the recovery periods between the focus blocks, between the focus work days, across the week is the specific structure that makes the sustainable endurance training possible. The person who is training the focus endurance without the structured recovery is progressively depleting the resource rather than building it, which produces the burnout that looks like training failure but is actually the failure of the recovery practice that the training requires. Focus is endurance. The endurance is built through the progressive training that demands more than the current comfortable capacity and then allows the recovery that produces the adaptation. The adaptation is the building of the capacity. The building of the capacity is the development of the focus architecture that Chapter 8 integrates into the habit and identity level structures that make it permanent. Chapter 8 examines the specific neurological mechanism that makes the focus training permanent, the neuroplasticity that converts the practiced attentional behaviors into the structural efficiency that makes them the natural default. Chapter 8. Training the brain. The brain changes when you train it. Neuroplasticity is the neurological basis of the claim that has been implicit throughout this audiobook that the focus capacity that the distraction environment has degraded can be rebuilt, that the attentional architecture that has been weakened by the consistent demands of the fragmented attention mode can be strengthened by the consistent demands of the sustained focus mode, and that the changes produced by the training are real, structural, and durable rather than merely the temporary improvements of a fresh resolution that fades when the difficulty increases. The specific neuroplastic changes that focused attentional training produces are the strengthening of the prefrontal networks that govern the directed, sustained attention, the increased connectivity between the prefrontal regions that control the attentional direction and the sensory and cognitive regions that the attention is being directed toward. the increased myelination of the neural pathways that support the sustained engagement, and the reduction in the baseline activation of the default mode network, the network of brain regions associated with the mind wandering and the internal distraction that competes with the focused engagement. These structural changes are the specific neurological expression of the capacity building that the training produces. Habit building is the behavioral side of the neuroplastic change, the specific mechanism through which the practiced attentional behaviors become the automatic defaults of the person who has practiced them sufficiently. The habit loop for the focus practice is the same structure described in the Rewiring Responses chapter of the Self-Control audiobook, the cue that initiates the habit, the routine that the habit executes, and the reward that reinforces the loop. For the focus practice, the cue is the entry into the designated focus environment or focus time period. The routine is the sustained, single task, distraction-removed engagement with the chosen work, and the reward is the specific cognitive satisfaction of the completed deep work session, the sense of having genuinely engaged with something, the tangible progress on the task, the qualitatively different experience of the completed focus block compared to the fragmented distracted work session. The reward of the completed focus block is initially less compelling than the dopamine-driven reward of the distraction behavior that the habit is replacing. This is the specific challenge of the focus habit building. The initial investment produces smaller immediate rewards than the behavior it is replacing, which makes the early habit maintenance dependent on the discipline of the deliberate training rather than the pull of the habit reward. This changes progressively as the focus capacity develops and the quality of the deep work session improves. The early sessions are effortful and the rewards are modest. The later sessions are more naturally engaging, the deep immersion is more accessible, and the quality of the cognitive output, the genuine understanding, the creative synthesis, the tangible progress on the meaningful work becomes the compelling reward that sustains the habit. Repetition cycles are the specific structure of the habit building that converts the deliberate practice into the automatic default. The repetition cycle is not the single dramatic commitment to a new behavior, it is the specific, consistent, daily repetition of the focus practice across the period that genuine habit formation requires. The neuroscience suggests that habit formation for complex behaviors requires weeks to months of consistent practice before the behavior begins to achieve the automaticity that characterizes the genuine habit. The commitment to the repetition cycle across this timeline is the specific investment that converts the deliberate practice into the genuine habit. The brain changes when you train it. The changes are real, structural, neuroplasty. The training that produces them is the consistent, progressive, repetition-based practice of the focused attentional behavior across the timeline that genuine neural restructuring requires. The changes, once produced or durable, they are not the temporary improvement of the initial motivation, but the genuine structural increase in the capacity that the consistent training has built. This durability is the specific reason that the investment in the focus training is a genuine investment rather than a temporary benefit that fades when the effort reduces. Chapter 9 develops the identity-level dimension of the focus development, the specific shift in the self-concept that makes the developed focus capacity the natural expression of who you are rather than the maintained practice of a separately held goal. Chapter 9 Focus as identity. You become what you consistently attend to. The identity dimension of focus is the level at which the focus capacity shifts from the maintained discipline to the natural expression, from something you are working to achieve to something you are. This shift is the specific product of the accumulated evidence from the consistent practice of the preceding chapters, the many focus sessions that have demonstrated that the sustained attention is possible, the deepening quality of the work those sessions have produced, and the specific self-knowledge that comes from having done the demanding thing consistently. The identity shift is also the most important long-term sustainability factor for the developed focus practice. The person who maintains the focus behavior through the aspiration to be more focused is dependent on the energy of that aspiration, and aspirational energy, like motivational energy, is depleted by use and is specifically lowest in the conditions where the focus is most difficult to maintain. The person who maintains the focus behavior through the identity of being someone who engages deeply with their work is drawing on a different and more durable source, the self-consistency motivation that makes the identity consistent behavior feel natural and the identity inconsistent behavior feel wrong. The identity shift that produces the focus identity is built from the same accumulated evidence mechanism described in the Becoming Unshakable chapter of the Self-Control audiobook, the many instances of the identity-consistent behavior that together constitute the evidence from which the identity is assembled. Each focus session is a piece of evidence that you are the person who engages deeply with their work. Each instance of the deliberate noise elimination is a piece of evidence that you are the person who governs their attention. Each return of the drifted attention is a piece of evidence that you are the person who maintains the engagement despite the drift. The evidence accumulates. The identity consolidates. The identity sustains the behavior that produced the evidence. The discipline mindset is the specific cognitive orientation of the person who has built the focus identity, the orientation toward the sustained engagement as the natural and appropriate mode of cognitive functioning rather than as the effortful exception to the distracted default. The person with the discipline mindset does not experience the focus session as a struggle against the natural tendency to be distracted. They experience the distracted mode as the departure from their natural tendency to engage deeply in experience that happens. That is noticed, that is corrected, but that is no longer the default that the focus is the exception to. Long-term behavior is the specific expression of the identity level shift, the sustained focus practice across the months and years of the genuinely engaged life. Maintained not through the continuous reinvestment of the motivational energy that the discipline mindset replaces, but through the identity expression that makes the deep engagement the natural expression of who you are. The long-term behavior is the cumulative product of many short-term practice sessions, each one contributing its small increment of the structural capacity and its small piece of the identity evidence that together constitute the genuinely focused life. You become what you consistently attend to. This is not a motivational claim. It is the description of the specific neuroplastic and identity-building mechanism through which the consistent attentional practice produces both the structural capacity and the self-connect that make the deep focus the natural expression of the person who has built it. The attention that is consistently directed toward the deep engagement builds the brain that finds the deep engagement natural. The attention that is consistently directed toward the shallow, distracted mode builds the brain that finds the distraction natural. The choice of where to consistently direct the attention is the choice of what the brain becomes. Chapter 10 develops the culmination of everything the preceding 9 chapters have built, the life lived with the clarity that the developed focus architecture produces. Chapter 10. Living with clarity. When you have focus, you have control. The clarity that the developed focus architecture produces is not the clarity of having simple problems or uncrowded days. It is the clarity of engaging with whatever complexity the day contains from the position of full cognitive availability, of having the attentional resource directed at the genuine priorities rather than fragmented across the continuous demands of the distraction environment, and of being able to think about the things that matter with the depth and quality that genuine thinking requires. Clear thinking is the most immediate practical expression of the developed focus architecture. The person who can sustain the deep engagement with a complex problem is doing qualitatively different thinking from the person who is engaging with the same problem in the distracted, fragmented mode. The quality difference is in the depth of the analysis, the number of dimensions of the problem that are engaged with, the connections between different elements of the problem that are noticed, the novel approaches that the sustained engagement reveals that the surface engagement misses. This depth is the specific cognitive return on the attentional investment of the focus practice. Better decisions are the practical downstream of the clear thinking that the focused engagement produces. The decisions that most determine the quality of a life, the relationship decisions, the career decisions, the investment decisions, the commitments and the withdrawals, are almost entirely decisions that benefit from the deep, sustained, consequence modeling engagement that the focused attentional architecture makes available. The same decisions made in the fragmented, shallow attentional mode that the distraction environment produces are systematically less well analyzed, less fully considered, and less well aligned with the person's genuine values and long-term interests. The focus architecture is not just the means to better work outputs. It is the means to the genuinely better decisions that the genuinely focused engagement with the important questions of the life produces. The calm mind is the experienced quality of the life that the developed focus architecture produces, and its relationship to the control that the chapter hook names is precise rather than metaphorical. The distracted mind is the anxious mind, the mind that is continuously registering the unfinished tasks, the unanswered messages, the unconsumed content, the unchecked notifications. The calm mind is the one that is fully present with what it is doing, that is not continuously monitoring the distraction environment for the variable reward that might have arrived, and that has the genuine experience of being where it is rather than being always potentially somewhere else. When you have focus, you have control. The control is not over the external world. The distractions will continue to exist. The demands will continue to arrive. The distraction environment will continue to compete for the attentional resource. The control is over where the attentional resource goes, over which engagements receive the cognitive investment, on what schedule, in what depth. That control is the specific form of agency over one's own cognitive life that the focused person has built and the distracted person has ceded. The life lived with the developed focus architecture is the life of the person whose cognitive resource is primarily directed at their own genuine priorities, whose best thinking is going to the things that actually matter, whose creative and analytical capacity is being applied to the work that most warrants it, and who is present in the experiences, the relationships, and the work that constitute the genuine substance of the life rather than being continuously pulled away by the variable reward loop of the distraction environment. This life is built from the accumulated practice of the preceding chapters. The training sessions of Chapter 4. The deep work structures of Chapter 5. The noise elimination of Chapter 6. The endurance development of Chapter 7. The neuroplastic building of Chapter 8. The identity consolidation of Chapter 9. Each chapter a layer. The layers together the architecture. The architecture, the expression of the focused person that this audiobook has been building toward. The attention you had left at the beginning of this audiobook is not all you have. The attention you can build through the specific, progressive, consistent practices that the 10 chapters describe is the full cognitive resource of the person whose brain has been trained to direct it deliberately rather than having it taken by whoever has the most sophisticated attention technology. That person is who you are building. Closing. The Focused Life. 10 chapters, 1 reclaimed capacity. Not the capacity for the occasional moment of focus. The architectural development of the genuinely focused mind, the mind that consistently directs its attentional resource at the genuine priorities. That sustains the deep engagement that genuinely productive and genuinely satisfying cognitive work requires. And that experiences the distraction environment as the continuous competition for a resource that the person has now learned to govern from the inside rather than having governed from the outside. Chapter 1 established the nature of the crisis, the active, engineered competition for the attentional resource that the digital environment conducts. The specific cognitive costs of the fragmented attention that it produces, and the progressive degradation of the deep cognitive capacities that the sustained engagement with the constant stimulation prevents. Chapter 2 named the mechanisms: the cognitive fatigue, the information overload, the lack of mental recovery, and the reassurance that the experience of focus impairment is not the evidence of personal inadequacy but the accurate report of a neurological condition produced by specific environmental demands. Chapter 3 mapped the dopamine mechanism through which the distraction environment has engaged the neurological reward system and made the distraction behavior more compelling than the willpower-based resistance can reliably counter. Chapter 4 began the rebuild focus as a skill, trainable through the progressive demand on the attentional capacity, the consistent repetition that builds the neural infrastructure, and the discipline that maintains the training across the early sessions before the capacity has built to the level that makes the training self-sustaining. Chapter 5 developed the deep work mode, the focus block structure, the pre-removal of distraction sources, the mental immersion quality that the uninterrupted engagement produces, and the qualitatively superior cognitive output that distinguishes the deep work from the shallow. Chapter 6 built the noise elimination practice, the environmental design that makes the undistracted state the default, the capture and defer technique for the internal distraction, and the attentional minimalism that preserves the resource for the genuine priorities. Chapter 7 developed the endurance dimension, the progressive training past the discomfort point, the increasing duration that the consistent training makes possible, and the recovery practice that makes the sustainable endurance training possible. Chapter 8 established the neuroplastic foundation, the brain changes when you train it. The structural changes of the focused attentional practice are real and durable. And the habit building that converts the deliberate practice into the automatic default is the specific mechanism that makes the change permanent. Chapter 9 consolidated the identity level: you become what you consistently attend to. The identity of the person who engages deeply built from the accumulated evidence of many consistent focus sessions, maintained by the self-consistency motivation of the identity expression is the specific development that makes the focused practice the natural expression of who you are rather than the continuously maintained aspiration toward who you want to be. Chapter 10, named The Life That the Identity Produces, the clear thinking, the better decisions, the calm mind, and the specific form of control that the focused person has over their own cognitive life, and the genuine engagement with the genuine priorities. The distraction environment will not change. The variable reward loop will continue to compete for the attentional resource. The attention capture technology will continue to improve. What changes is the person engaging with it. The task is here. Your attention is here. The phone is elsewhere. You breathe. You begin. And you stay. Deeply. That is the focused life.